What's up, y'all? Happy holidays to everyone watching this. Last video, we covered every single UFC pay-per-view throughout 2024, and if you have not watched that video yet, make sure to go watch it because today we're going to be rating every single fight night similar to the pay-per-views solely on enjoyability. I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's jump right into it. Up first, we have UFC Mexico City, Brandon Moreno versus Brandon Royval 2. I'm going to put this at the C tier. The fights weren't bad, but for some reason, a lot of these fights were very forgettable. The main event between Moreno versus Royval was a high level flyweight scrap, but neither guy really looked to put the fight away, and it kind of made it dull at some points of the fight. If I were to tell you one highlight on this card, it would probably be Yair Rodriguez versus Brian Ortega, because during the pre fight media day, Ortega was rambling on about rebirthing himself like an eagle. I don't know why he felt the need to mention it, but it was really funny, considering it was just so random. Through sheer will and autism, Ortega managed to take down Rodriguez and latch up an arm triangle in the third round after getting butchered on the feet for the first few minutes. You also had Daniel Zellhuber jabbing his way through Francisco Prado and Manuel Torres absolutely bodying Chris Duncan. While the prelims did have a lot of finishes, I don't remember any of them off the top of my head because a lot of these fights were below the 155-pound weight class, making them very forgettable because it felt like I was watching the same fight over and over again at some point. Overall, a very mid level card. Up next, we have UFC Atlantic City, Aaron Blanchfield versus Manon Fiorot. UFC Atlantic City was an abomination of a fight card. The most notable performance on this card was the fact that Chris Weidman got a KO over Bruno Silva via a 1-2 eye poke. And I thought about going to Atlantic City because it was pretty close to where I lived, but then I realized Blanchfield versus Fiorot is a terrible main event. I was right considering Erin Blanchfield, despite being the number 2 ranked women's flyweight division fighter, cannot defend herself against a check left hook. Fiorot would just catch her with a left hook every time Blanchfield would try to trudge forward. That pattern repeated itself for nearly the entire fight. The only good performance here was Joaquin Buckley versus Vicente Luque and Kyle Nelson versus Bill Algeo. But the Buckley versus Luque fight was just kind of sad because it felt like Luque couldn't do anything after round 2. Luque just curled up into the fetal position as soon as Buckley hit him with any good punch, and it felt very awkward to watch when you factor in that Luque suffered through a brain hemorrhage not that long ago. Also, the fight between Nelson and Aljo was prematurely stopped when things were just getting heated up in the end of the first round. Aljo got badly rocked by Nelson, but he was able to show signs of trying to recover and fight back. Despite not being totally out from the fight, the refs prematurely stepped in for some reason, ruining the only fight that could have ended with a satisfying conclusion. This was one of the worst events the UFC put together outside of UFC 302. It's a shame because I wanted to go to a UFC event in New Jersey sometime in 2024. But then I realized most of the events here in New Jersey are either $600 for nosebleed seats or pure garbage like UFC Atlantic City. We move on to UFC St. Louis, Derek Lewis versus Rodrigo Nascimento. A really solid fight night card, and I'm going to put this at the A tier. The prelims were stacked with talented fighters that are on the come up, and a lot of these fighters showcased some of the best performances of their careers. For example, Pace Hooper showcased why he was one of the best unranked lightweight prospects by beating the absolute piss out of a world class kickboxer in Vyacheslav Borshev. If you told me that this limey motherfucker would be able to destroy Vyacheslav Borshev on the feet alone, I would have called you retarded. It turns out it would be Chase Hooper dropping Vyacheslav Borshev in the first round, and from there it'd be one-way traffic to domination. Also, you had Esteban Ribovich shock the crowd by knocking out Terrence McKinney with a head kick in the first round. And in the main card, there were a lot of fraud checks handed out to upcoming prospects. Robelis Despain was schooled by Waldo Cortez Acosta, both in the grappling and striking. I remember a lot of people, including myself, thought that he would be within the top 5 in the near future. Unfortunately, being a bronze medalist at Taekwondo doesn't really mean shit when it comes to actual fighting. And Carlos Diego Ferreira woke up from his year-long slumber and decided to hand Mateusz Rebecki another fat-ass fraud check. It really hurt me considering I believed in Rebecki so much that I thought he was able to get at least into the top 10 of the lightweight division. But unfortunately, this is what Carlos Diego Ferreira does. He would rather fraud check another lightweight prospect instead of trying to move up the rankings by fighting more than once a year. Carlos Oberg also slept Alonzo Manyfield in like 10 seconds to get himself into the top 10 of the light heavyweight division. The co-main event, Joaquin Buckley outclassed Nursultan Ruziboyev despite being 7 inches shorter. I know that both guys have the same reach advantage, but I was really impressed uh, just from the fact that Ruziboyev was moving down to middleweight. Wait, I'm sorry, moving from middleweight to welterweight. And finally, in the main event, Derek Lewis knocked out a Brazilian cab driver and then proceeded to moon the St. Louis crowd. This card was a vibe to sit through because a lot of these were fun fights regardless of the skill level. If the UFC pumped out more cards like the St. Louis card, I think a lot less people will be complaining about the quality of UFC fight cards. We're moving on to UFC Louisville, Jared Cannonier versus Nasruddin Imavov. I'm also going to put this at the A tier. Once again, the prelims were very fun to watch. Carlos Pratis destroyed Charles Radke's liver with a beautiful step and knee in the second round, and Ludovic Klein showcased a dominant performance against Thiago Moises, who is a very good lightweight just outside of the rankings. And the main card overall was arguably one of the best this year. Outside of the opener, there were a lot of highlight reel performances. Bruno Ferreira knocked out Dustin Stoltzfus with a spinning elbow. Raul Rosas Jr. submitted Ricky Tercios in a pretty entertaining grappling heavy fight. Most shocking of all, Dominic Reyes revived his career by slumping Dustin Jacoby out in the first round. It was a feel-good moment considering where Reyes' career was heading right after his fight with John Jones. Had he lost this one, I think the UFC would have cut him from the roster, but good that Dominic Reyes gets to stay. Unfortunately, the main event, Jared Cannonier versus Nasruddin Imavov, ended prematurely. For some reason, Jason Herzog awarded Imavov a TKO after Imavov just rocked Cannonier. And it wasn't like Cannonier wasn't fighting back, nor was Cannonier in the fetal position. It honestly felt like the UFC told Jason Herzog to get rid of Cannonier any opportunity he gets prior to the fight happening. What could have been one of the best Fight Night cards of 2024 was ultimately ruined by a premature stoppage in the main event. That being said, I still enjoyed watching almost all of the fights on this card regardless because they were fun scraps. We're going to move on to UFC Saudi Arabia, Robert Whitaker versus Ikram Aliskerov. I'm going to put this the B tier. Now, a lot of you in the comments might disagree with me, but just hear me out. This fight card was stacked with a lot of high level fights. It just was not as entertaining as any of the fight cards that were above the Saudi card. There were a lot of good fights, but at the same time, there were a lot of uneventful or outright controversial fights. For example, in the prelims, Renat Brocardina versus Nicholas Dalby. I was somewhat hyped for this because I think the winner of this fight would have got a ranked opponent at the welterweight division, but unfortunately, the fight ended rather stale, with Fakhretdinov holding onto a double leg for dear life in rounds 2 and 3. There was also Nasrat Haqparast versus Jared Gordon, which was a crazy back and forth war, but there was a clear winner in Jared Gordon who did not get his hand raised in the final round. I remember Gordon tagging Haqparast up with a southpaw jab, and it was Jared Gordon who was dictating the pace of the fight. Sure, Haqparast was throwing back and forth, and he was throwing good extended combinations, but you can see the majority of the round, Gordon was beating Haqparast to the punch throughout the third round. Despite everything I told you, however, the judges gave this fight to Nasrat Haqparast, and it just ruined the vibe of the fight due to the incorrect decision. And in the main card, it wasn't that much better. There were Shara Magomedov versus Antonio Trocoli. Trocoli is awful, but somehow it took Shara till the third round to definitively push Trocoli away. Prior to the finish, the fight was very uneventful. Both guys looked very sloppy, and the only reason Cheryl was able to put Tricoli away was because Tricoli literally disconnected from reality for like 20 seconds in the final round. We also have Kelvin Gastelum versus Daniel Rodriguez. The fight was all right, but Gastelum missed weight by 15 pounds, and it was evident throughout the fight because Gastelum would just take Rodriguez down and would just smudge him up against the canvas. Again, if you take the fight at face value, it was all right, but considering Gastelum missed weight by 15 pounds, I expected more. But that being said, there were also a lot of really fun fights to watch. For example, in the prelims, we had Felipe Lima versus Muhammad Naimov. Lima came in as a short notice replacement, making his debut in the UFC. Throughout the fight, you can tell that Lima was the more technical fighter. However, he looked to be a lot smaller than his opponent, Muhammad Naimov. Despite being 2 rounds down, Lima was able to find Naimov's back and ultimately choke him out in the third round. I thought this was really impressive, considering Naimov is a very good fighter who sits just outside of the featherweight rankings. And the main card also had a lot of fun fights, like Volkan Uzdemir sleeping Johnny Walker in the first round of the main card opener. And later in the co-main event, Alexander Volkov schooled Sergey Pavlovich for 3 rounds straight, which is really impressive considering Pavlovich was once regarded as the most dangerous heavyweight contender in the UFC. But finally, in the main event, Robert Whitaker knocked out Ikram Aliskerov in the first round with a nasty uppercut. I expected Whitaker to win, but we rarely see Whitaker finish his opponents off in the first round. So to see Whitaker go for the kill that early capped off this fight card very nicely. There were a lot of great fights, but at the same time, there were a lot of shit fights or fight results. It's not to say that the card was bad, but I don't think it was as enjoyable as the other fight cards in the A tier. We move on to UFC Colorado, Rose Namajunas versus Tracy Cortez. I'm going to put this at the B tier. There were a lot of good performances, especially in the prelims. Evan Elder submits Darius Flowers with an arm triangle in the second round. Luana Santos submits Maria Agapova in the first round with a rear naked choke. And Montel Jackson knocked out Damon Blackshear in 18 seconds with a clean 1-2 down the pipe. Finally, Charles Johnson went to an all-out brawl with Joshua Van and came out on top in the third round by knocking out Van with a vicious uppercut. The main card also had some highlight-worthy performances. Julian Erosa lashed up a nasty guillotine against Christian Rodriguez in the first round, and Gene Silva put on an absolute masterclass against Drew Dober, which really impressed me considering he filled in as a short notice replacement and fought originally at featherweight. My issue, however, is that the co-main and main event massively slowed down the hype of this card. The co-main event, Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Muslim Salikov, was very uneventful. The best way to describe it, it looked like a cookout brawl between two drunk uncles in their mid-50s. The main event was even worse. Tracy Cortez is awful at fighting. To this day, I still can't tell you what she does well because I don't think she even takes her career seriously. The highlight of the main event was when Namajunas threw a punch to knock out one of Cortez's fake eyelashes. It's like Cortez was expecting to look pretty throughout a fight. I don't know how those words make sense until Tracy Cortez did what she did. Because the main and co-main event were such garbage, I can't justify putting this alongside the other A-tier Fight Night cards. However, the prelims and the few fights on the main card really did get me hyped enough to watch the entire thing regardless. We move on to UFC Abu Dhabi, Corey Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov. I'm also going to put this at the B tier. I remember I was initially hyped for this event because there were a lot of high profile fights. But after watching the entire thing, I was just left indifferent to the entire event. The prelims were overall alright. Guy Herbert pieced up Rolando Bedoya using very technical and calculated striking. And I was really impressed with Jordan Vucenic because he was lighting up Guram Kuletsi on the feet in the first round, and you never really see anyone do that to Guram Kutelezi. Unfortunately, Vucenic was making his debut in the UFC on short notice, and his lack of experience showed. His indecisiveness towards the later rounds of the fight really costed him, and Kutelezi was able to capitalize on this and came out on top in the final seconds of the third round. Still a good fight regardless, but it was a little bit of a letdown. The only highlight worthy performance on the prelims was Paul Fernandez knocking out a random UAE fighter in the first 15 seconds of the fight, and Azamat Murzakanov knocking out Alonzo Manyfield in the second round. And it wasn't like the main card was that much better. The only fights that were really interesting were Yoel Alvarez knocking out Elvis Brenner in the third round, and Davison Figueiredo dropping Chito Vera in the third round of the feature fight. Like the co-main event between Sharon Magomedov and Mikhail Olasechuk, it was all right, but considering where Mikhail Olasechuk was in his career and what his past opponents did to him, I found Sharon Magomedov's performance rather pedestrian. And finally, we get to the main event between Corey Sandhagen and Umar Nurmagomedov. It was a high level fight, but let's be honest, the striking exchanges were god awful to watch. Corey Sandhagen didn't really come out with his flashy techniques. He just stood there doing nothing, and Umar would just throw 1, 2 jabs and more, which is how he was able to win the striking exchanges. The only interesting parts of the fight were when Umar Nurmagomedov was shooting a takedown and Corey Sandhagen would just defend it. Other than that, nothing really happened in the fight. Overall, a lot of technical fights that I can watch back to learn a few things regarding striking and grappling, but most of the performances on this card did not deliver in terms of excitement whatsoever. We move on to UFC Paris Renato Moicano versus Benoit Saint Denis. This card was hyped from start to finish. French fans are one of the best fan bases, in my opinion, because no matter who wins, they get hyped when the fighter puts on a good performance, and it makes it for a good interaction between fighters and the crowd. For a fight night card, the prelims were pretty good. You had Chris Duncan latch up a tight guillotine against Bellagio Oki. You had Ludovic Klein versus Roosevelt Roberts. Not the one sided domination I expected from Klein, but a win nonetheless. Omar Sy dominated Dawoon Jung for 3 rounds straight, and Ion Kutalaba got his first win in like 3 or 4 years, which is very good to see. The main card is where the hype built up, however. Feresian knocked out Murphy with a standing knee after dominating him for 3 rounds straight. Morgan Charrier knocks out Gabriel Miranda with a devastating hook in the second round. Ryan Battle proceeded to beat the shit out of Kevin Toussaint, then proceeds to flip the French crowd off before getting on the post-fight interview, asking if anyone actually believed that he was going to lose a fist fight to a French dude. That would have been the highlight of the event, but the main event between Moicano and BSD really stole the show. Moicano puts on one of the most one-sided beatdowns I have ever seen in quite some time. Now, I was a Moicano fan prior to this fight, but even I did not expect Moicano to dismantle BSD from start to finish. Moicano then proceeds to trash Emmanuel Macron during his post-fight interview, and the French crowd went wild because, from what I am hearing, the French do not like Macron whatsoever. The prelims were rather lackluster, but the main card was one of the most exciting events the UFC put on for their fans. In terms of pure enjoyment, it's very hard to top UFC Paris 2024. We move on to UFC Edmonton, Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi. I'm going to put this at the C tier. The prelims were really good. There were like 4 noteworthy performances. Cody Gibson absolutely demolished Chad Analiger for 3 rounds. Yusuf Zalal submitted Jack Shore in the second round after dropping him on the feet. Carl Jourdain and Eamon Zahavi proved to be the only few Canadian men with testosterone because these two were the only Canadians that put on an impressive performance against their opponent. The main card, however, was a little bit dodgy. For every good fight we got, we also got a terrible fight. Like Mike Mallett versus Trevin Giles faked a fight for 15 minutes. Genuinely considered turning the card off because this performance was so awful. But then right after that, Dustin Stoltzfus knocked down Marc-Andre Barriou in the first round and pulled me right back in because watching Dustin Stoltzfus KO someone in 2024 was insane to watch at the time. You also had the co-main event, and I did not care to watch because my friend called me out to go into a nearby bar, and I'm glad I did because I went to check the fight later and check the comments. Safe to say, this fight was an abomination. But in the main event, Brandon Moreno absolutely styled on Amir Albazi. While I did think it was a fun fight, part of me was asking, how in the world is Amir Albazi in the top 10? As much as I wanted to praise Moreno, at the same time, Albazi literally did nothing for 25 minutes, and it genuinely made me concerned considering he is currently the number 3 ranked flyweight in the division. That main event perfectly encapsulated my overall assessment of this main card. Impressive from one half, while dog shit from the other half. We move on to UFC Macau, Peter Yan versus Davison Figueiredo. This was a great card. My only problem was that this card started at 3 in the fucking morning for some reason. The prelims were worth the sleep deprivation because this card was basically a showcase for the Road to UFC fighters. A lot of these fights ended with a brutal knockout. One girl named Ming Shi timed such a beautiful head kick on her opponent that her opponent was unable to wake up for quite some time. It got concerning to the point where we thought the girl might have died. Unfortunately, we got confirmation that the girl survived. There was also other fights to take note of, like Xiao Long. He knocked out his opponent Quang Li with a brutal right hand down the middle, then proceeded to bark like a dog with rabies in front of the camera. I thought this was really funny. Unfortunately, I could barely express that laughter because this was going on roughly at 5 in the morning. I also really enjoyed watching Loner Kavanaugh fight because he utilizes kicks very well for someone who is very short, and I think that's impressive. Unfortunately, because the main card started at 6 a.m., I took a nap and I can't really give you an overall assessment because from what I've heard, a lot of these fights ended either very early or it ended in very lackluster decisions. But fortunately, I was able to wake up when Bruce Buffer, I believe, announced Peter Yan versus Davison Figueiredo, and I'm glad that I woke up for this fight because what a masterclass Peter Yan put together against Davison Figueiredo. Jan's uppercuts were devastating, and in his Sotogari grips were so clean throughout the fight. It's such a good moment when Peter Yan is winning because he is one of my favorite fighters in this sport. Had I not needed to stay up all night to watch this, I probably would have rated this a lot higher, but watching Peter Yan is always enjoyable in my opinion. Therefore, UFC Macau belongs in the A tier. Last but not least, arguably one of the best fight cards of 2024, UFC Tampa, Colby Covington versus Joaquin Buckley. I really enjoyed watching this whole event. The only complaint I had was with the terrible women's fights, but there were only two, so I will let it slide because every other fight on this card was very good. Davy Grant sent Ramon Tavares back into the apex by outstriking him for almost 15 minutes straight. Felipe Lima danced circles around Miles Johns, winning a dominant decision. And Sean Woodson got his first round knockout over Fernando Padilla, which I never thought was going to happen at the time. So good for Sean Woodson. Yoel Alvarez and Michael Johnson also knocked their opponents out, and the crowd was hyped as fuck. In the main card, notable performances include Dustin Jacoby knocking out Vitor Petrino with one punch, Manel Cap tapping into Ultra Instinct and putting on a show against Bruno Silva. And even 41-year-old Up Swanson knocked out Billy Quarantillo in the third round of their fight. And finally, Joaquin Buckley beat the brakes off of Colby Covington for 3 rounds before the doctors came in and stopped the fight. Was it an early stoppage? Yes, but Colby was getting his ass beat for at least 15 minutes straight, on top of the eye getting cut. So I count that as a Buckley TKO regardless. Now, in terms of post fight entertainment, this was nowhere near UFC Paris. However, the fights themselves were much better in comparison, which is why I understand why so many people believe this was the best fight night card of 2024. All right, this will be it for today. Like and subscribe, everyone. Happy holidays, and I will see you guys soon. Peace.